Hello everyone, my name is Sebastian Verpoten and I'm an activist at Mellemfolkeligt here in Aarhus, Denmark. Mellemfolkeligt is an organization that fights against inequalities and is part of the Global Federation of Action Aid. And today I stand here with Sushovan Dhar, who is an activist in India. And we're going to talk about the ongoing farmers' protests that are happening in India right at the moment. So Sushovan, just to introduce you a little bit, you are part of the CADTM, which is a committee for abolition of illegitimate debt. You're also part of the AEPF, Asia Europe People's Forum, the SAEPE, Southern Asia Alliance for Poverty Eradication, and you're also vice president of the Progressive Plantation Workers Union, as well as connected to many other organizations in India. And in India, for the moment, they've been happening like some very big protests, like farmers' protests about 3 recent farm laws that have been introduced in the Parliament of India in September 2020. And like these protests apparently have been huge. There hasn't been many things in the media here in Europe about it, but I can see that on the 26th of November, there was a national general strike, about 250 million of people that were striking in support of the farmers' union. And even in recent days, there was like some very big protests. So maybe you can explain us a little bit about what is happening and why it is happening for the moment.
Oh, yes, there's a huge protest of farmers going on. Basically, this protests are located around Delhi. Now, it started in the second week of December in Delhi, when farmers from the northern Indian states of Punjab and Haryana started coming to Delhi, and they encircled the city, setting up camps in a number of, they were prevented by the police to enter the city of Delhi. So they camped around a number of places around the city of Delhi to protest against the recently brought in the farm laws, the agricultural laws, especially 3. In fact, these 3 laws about which we can discuss later, perceived as something very anti-farmer to the against the interest of the farmers, and the farmers are protesting against these laws. Currently, this protest of farmers, it's not limited to Punjab and Haryana, but it has also spread to another North Indian, very big North Indian state called Uttar Pradesh, and also Rajasthan. So there's a lot of political churning going on at this point of time around the farmers' protest. This is seen as a new symbol of defiance, a new symbol of protest against the fascist regime that's in power in India for quite some long time.
Yeah, and so like you say, it started about 3 laws, and maybe it would be interesting to know, like, what is it? Why is it happening now? This protest. What is in this law that started it? But also maybe is there more like historical context that it relates to that build up to this moment?
Yeah, in fact, it started with there's one law, the introduction of a new law, which is called the Farming Produce, Trade and Commerce Promotion and Facilitation Act 2020, the Farmers Empowerment and Protection Agreement and Price Assurance and Firm Services Act 2020, and the Essential Commodities Amendment Act 2020. In fact, the Essential Commodities Act has been amended. It's not a new law that has been brought in by the government. So one of the laws which says about the Farming Produce Trade and Commerce Promotion and Facilitation Act 2020 speaks about the doing away of local markets, which is basically, we called it mandis, which exist in India. Well, it's age old, it exists for a long time. This is where the farmers buy and sell their produce normally. So it does away with that, and the farmers fear. Then there's an agreement on Price Assurance and Farm Services Act. The farmers fear that the guaranteed minimum support price for a number of crops that they were getting will be, done away with, will be dismantled. Now the farmers, now what is the minimum support price? The minimum support price can be seen as a sort of a living wage for the farmers. Well, we can speak about, if you talk about formal sector workers, now you have the minimum wages and the living wages. So these were seen as sort of, minimum or living wages for the farmers. The price is being guaranteed, the price of their products, the price of what they produce are being guaranteed. In fact, that has been done away in most of the parts of India successively, through administrative negligence and many other things, but it was strongly protected still date in Punjab and Haryana. So therefore, you see, for the farmers, it's a question of, they'll almost lose their livelihoods. They're fearing that the new laws which are aimed to bring in investments, both foreign direct investment and investment by the big bourgeoisie in India, will actually make them do away with their lands, contract farming. So it will actually be big agribusiness, which will control the agriculture, and they will simply be workers in their land. So this is a fight for their survival sort of a thing. Now, while the MSP, which is much discussed around, maybe the immediate cause that sparked this whole rebellion, that sparked this whole protest, I think this is the tip of the iceberg. There has been, Indian agriculture has been in severe crisis since the last 3 decades. It's in a serious crisis for the last 3 decades. And this current movement and the current mobilization of farmers are an expression of that. So this is what largely the protests are. The farmers have said, and they're very, very determined at this point of time, that until and unless the laws are withdrawn, the acts are withdrawn, they will not stop the protests. There have been 10 rounds of talks with government, and the government also proposed to put this law in abeyance, put this law in abeyance in the sense that not to implement it for the next 2 years, but the farmers did not go for the compromise. Well, essentially that was a trap by the government to pacify the farmers, to send them packing home. But the farmers were, the movement has shown the maturity, the leadership has shown the maturity of not falling into that trap, but it still continues to protest until the 3 laws will be cancelled. There's been a number of attacks. There's been all sort of attacks, criminalization, arrestations, police going against the farmers, intimidation. The farmers' movement initially was labeled as a pro-Khalistani provocation. A pro-Khalistan, Khalistan means the movement for the secession of Punjab, which was there in the end 70s till 83, 84. The movement for the secession of the province of Punjab. So it has been labeled as something. When you say something as Khalistani, you can naturally establish that it's something anti-national, anti-patriotic. It's against the interests of the country. Luckily enough, and thanks to the mobilization, it's not a question of sheer luck, but a question of political mobilization, determined political mobilization, that this sort of the ploy that the government resorted to was not successful, and we still have the movement today.
Yeah, and it seems like a very tense situation right now. There's a few articles I could read were in the Guardian about protest and counter-protest, and maybe it would be interesting just to know, like, how the government is trying to justify these laws, like what are the grounds that they present, and how people, not only farmers, but generally people are perceiving it.
Okay,
if you can tell a bit about...
The government has a lot of propaganda for this law. It says that this law is the interest of the farming community in India. This law is in the interest of agriculture in India. Now, what do they say when they say that they're doing with the local markets or the mandis and the minimum support price? They say the farmers are free to buy and sell. They are not limited by law. This is like doing away the guaranteed minimum legal wage, saying that workers are free to, just go and bargain. But mind it, you can understand the minimum support law is minimum. The workers are always free to sell above the minimum wage, free to sell their labor power, above the minimum wage. So similarly, accordingly here, one would be a fool to believe that, because the minimum support price is not compulsory or obligatory for farmers to sell. If they get larger prices, if they can make a fortune, they can just go and sell. It's not compulsory. This is the minimum supported price. So that's one. Second is, the government is trying to say that, well, this will bring in investments, and you know about this whole story of investments and development and all these things. So initially, well, there's a lot of support of the government in the media, the official circles, and their lackeys. The current government has purchased almost all the media in India, and we rarely have the existence in a very few independent media that we have, or very few media that's not supportive of the government, even in very liberal bourgeois terms, not in a very revolutionary term, but in a very liberal bourgeois terms. There are very few media which is not bought over, or it's not pro-government. So the government and its lackeys in the media have been trying to say these things, but the farm, well, as you can see, the whole neoliberal consensus, the way it is built, and the hegemony it has over common people. So people would have believed it, but then this powerful farmers' mobilization has changed people's opinion also. Where, even if people don't understand what is exactly happening, most people are ignoring exactly happening. People understand that there's some problem. There's some problem, and then these people are not sitting there for nothing. And they have been sitting there in very biting cold, around 2 degrees. The nights are 2 degrees. Near Delhi border, it's very, very cold in the winters. The North Indian plains are very cold in winters, and temperatures reach to 0 degree even. So, well, that has changed the perceived opinion of people. And so this has hampered the prospects of the support for the ruling party at this point of time.
Yes, and it seems that it's also like the sign of very powerful farmers' unions. And I mean, talking from a European perspective, and we have, I don't know if you're aware about that, a lot of discussion about the renewal, for instance, for the moment of the Common Agricultural Pact, which is the system of funding for farming in Europe.
Yeah,
and there tend to be a lot of, in social movement, of critiques of the farming union as being too tied with big business and industrial farming and things like that. And would you say it's the same in India, or does this movement show that there's actually a very strong movement of small-scale farmers?
Yeah, in fact, the scenario of farming in India and India and many other countries of the quote-unquote third world, or the ex-colonial world, and Europe or the United States are not exactly the same. In India, like in most of the parts of Asia, Africa, especially Asia and Africa, we have a huge number of small-scale farmers. Now, India is a land of peasants. It has a huge number of farmers, small-scale farmers, and agro-industry has not been able to get inside the agriculture till so much. In fact, the way the government wants to bring in these laws is actually to make way for big agro-industry to go into agriculture. So I would not say that their interests are linked with big agro-business. Rather, it is against big agro-industry that they are protesting at this point of time. You see, the agriculture is in a severe crisis in India, as I told you. One important statistics is that which can explain the fact is that more than 300,000 farmers have committed suicide in the last 25 years. And this is due to severe indebtedness. huge debt. There's a huge agricultural debt in India. Now, this 300,000 is an official figure. It can be double, it can be triple, we don't know. Because if you don't own a piece of land, you're not registered as the National Crime Bureau doesn't recognize you as a farmer. So that is the case with many women who don't have who do the work of farming. Women do the most of the work of farming, but land is not in their name, so they are not recognized as farmers. They're seen as any other homicide. So this figure can double. So if you see this figure, which is just well, one indicator of how serious the problem is, the Indian agriculture is in a serious crisis for many reasons since the implementation of neoliberal agenda, and this enactment of the new laws or legislations and the change of another law are in fact a response of the right to this crisis. It's a response of the right, political right to this crisis, which is the support of the big Indian bourgeoisie, certainly. The big Indian bourgeoisie, like the international capital, they stand to gain by this. They have the interest tied with the implementation of such laws. So it's against this. And in fact, if I may continue a little bit about it, historically, this is not the first time that farmers in India are in protest or in rebellion. We have numerous peasant revolt in the country since I don't know, 1,000 years. One doesn't know, maybe 1,000 years. Much of it undocumented in the past. Historically, even till 70s, when I started, well, I did not start, but I was small. I was a young boy. So even till the 70s and end 70s, the peasant movement centered around the question of land, the ownership of land, which in spirit was very anti-feudal. But now you have a movement which is not for the land, but which is actually to retain that land. It's against big corporations. It's against big capital, entry of big capital into agriculture. So it essentially has a very strong anti-capital component into it. One cannot say it's a very strong anti-capitalist movement, but it has a very strong anti-capital component into the movement. Farmers are openly saying about big agrobusiness.
Yeah, and that's very, I would suppose, interesting and inspiring to see how it can gather both consciousness about the right and the interest as farmers, but also have responses in the population. And I'm wondering, are there other sectors of the economy that are also taking inspiration from this movement or standing in support for it?
Oh yes. See, as you mentioned that the 26th of November, there was a general strike. There has also been an imposition of new labor codes, which are basically new labor laws, which is quite anti-worker. It's very, very anti-worker labor laws. If the laws are implemented, we don't have the time. We need a separate discussion on that. But if I am to highlight a few key essential points, the implementation of this labor laws will take out 50% of the workers out of the labor law, which means 50% of the workers will not have any legal coverage because they're raising the ceilings. So you say you have to implement this law, for example, if you have, 200 workers. So they just do it that you have to only implement it if you have 400 workers. So you take, and you understand in India, traditionally, it has been very small scale informal production. And even in the formal sector, what you have seen a big deal of informalization, which is actually fragmentation of the formal sector production. Like you have, if you look at the whole ready-made garment industry, the dress, clothes, the ready-made garment industry, it's no longer you have huge factories for that. It's small scale production. Many other things are given into this fragmentation, or what you call the informalization of the formal sector. So there was a change in labor laws, but the protest of the working workers was also not to that extent, which would have threatened the government or which would have forced the government to do so. There has been the spate of privatizations going on. In fact, 15th and 16th of March, there's this current privatization of banks, and 15th of 16th March, the bank unions have given for a strike, all India strike against the privatization of banks. So there have been movements, but they had not been that strong to impact the government or the ruling party or their popularity. Certainly, the farmers' movement has set the tone, and it can lead to a lot of precedent. I mean, a lot of other sectors can get encouraged. And this is one of the reasons why the government is unable to do the compromise of doing away with the act, because they were asked by a number of people, the media people, and a number of people in society have raised the question: if the farmers doesn't want, good for themselves, why do you implement it? Why do you impose it on them? The pure and simple answer of the government has been that if we take back these laws, there will be demands to take away other laws also that we have implemented.
And maybe that's also an interesting question now, I think, because you say like, okay, they've been fighting actually to take back these laws, but has there also been voices to go further than that and to try to analyze what other changes in society they would want? Is it centered about taking back these laws, or is it like it was, like for instance in France with your yellow vest movement, that they started to protest against one law, and then they started also to gather other meaning to it and other demands?
In fact, this farmers movement started against the MSP. Basically, it was provoked over the minimum support price. Now it has gone very anti-capital, anti-corporation, anti-corporate. The tone of the movement is currently very, very, very anti-corporate. It's not more radical than this at this point of time, frankly enough. There are enough questions about how to take the movement forward. How do you have the participation of larger section of society, especially the landless farm workers and the rural workers into it, integrated, though many of the landless peasant unions are also, peasant unions are also part of it. But the question is that this is possibly what I think is a task of the left to take it much beyond. The liberals won't be taking it much beyond. I mean, they would try to limit it to an extent. But this is the task of the left to take it much beyond, to have slogans, to have demands that can radicalize this movement even more. The question of food sovereignty, the question of food prices, for example, essential supplies all over India. Like one of the amendments that are being made is the Essential Commodities Amendment. Essential commodities were 14 essential commodities, the prices of which were considered very, very, very essential. So the prices were controlled by the government. The price of, for example, sugar, wheat, rice, sugar, and many other things. Now, if the farmers raise the demand of these prices, it has the potential to go beyond the scope of what the current movement aims. But if you look at the series of defeats of various sorts of movement in India in the last 7-8 years, more so after this government came to power, then this is certainly the tide is turning, and it will take a little bit of more time to go, because we were caught with reaction. There was a terrible reaction. It was a reactionary situation, but everything was going wrong. So it takes a little time to tide over, to go in the other direction. Things don't automatically switch to the other end. So maybe this is a phase of consolidation, one can say, to stop the march towards right wing, and to go to another, or to take another direction or dimension also as well.
And I mean, it's also, like, as an activist from Europe, very interesting for me to hear about how social movements are working in India. And I know that here we have a hard time sometimes connecting together or working together across various countries. And I know that India is a huge country with so many different communities and tendencies. So, like, as yourself an activist, can you maybe like elaborate a bit on that and how you work to support this movement?
The farmers' movement has also united the social movements and the movement, other movements around it. Last year we had a very long movement against the Citizenship Amendment Acts, which are very discriminatory citizenship amendment acts brought in by the current government. Extremely discriminatory. There was a lot of protest against it. But the protest was largely involved the left and the Muslim community. So it was a movement of a small minority. It was seen as a big movement because the small minority, even if they were 5% of the society, got united and were visible. But in terms of impacts, it was limited to that 5% or 7%. The farmers' movement has, then you have the whole pandemic and the lockdown for which everything got to, and the situation is extremely bad in India at this point of time. The livelihood is a big question now. So the economic crisis and the question of livelihood is a serious question. So the farmers' movement has the potential to galvanize, number one, many other sections of the society which are equally oppressed around it, and to encourage them to take up their demands. For example, the working class, demand of the working class, or demand of the workers against the new labor codes. The movement of women against a number of discriminatory laws that are brought against women. The movement of others, the Dalits, the religious minorities, against discrimination practiced by this government, not only laws, but extreme discrimination practiced by the government. The murder of democracy. So there are many aspects which has the potential to spark in the coming days. And therefore, a lot depends on the farmers' movement.
Yeah, and I mean, we strongly hope that they can find the solidarity that they need. I think it's also maybe interesting to talk a little bit about like how it relates to other global trends. In terms of like, I know there've been quite a few discussions recently about the fact that there was like a tide of a right-wing government coming to power in various countries. I think of Brazil, like the last few years in the United States, but also like in India, Haiti, many countries, but also like a lot of social movements starting to be very visible. I remember some data saying that 2018 was the year with the most protests in the world. And maybe how can you relate the situation in India right now to what you know about situation in other countries?
Yes, in fact, you had a right-wing wave starting from, say, the election of, Putin, Bolsonaro, Trump, Erdogan, Duterte in Philippines. You have the set of elected right-wing leaders. These are no more military coups, but the elected authoritarian governments, extremely authoritarian governments, elected around the world, and that had taken us aback. In most of the countries, we were almost in the same situation, and a different right-wing agenda sweeping like anything around the world. 2018, as you recall, yes, was a year of protest, and we had a farmers' mobilization in 2018 as well in India. What you see about the farmers' movement, I would say the rehearsal for this, the stage rehearsal for this was set in 2018, when hundreds of thousands of farmers gathered in Delhi, in Mumbai. Yeah, there was terrible movement. So there is a huge protest which is also going on around the world at this point of time. I don't know if you know about Russia. There's a strong movement in Russia going on against this world, against Putin government and its policies. It's very interesting to see a number of young school children coming out, though it's galvanized about Navalny. But this is not the movements are not to endorse Navalny's politics, but the movement are an occasion to express your real distress, to protest against the real conditions. It takes the shape number of times of different things. So there's been movement against Brazil against Bolsonaro. So I see this as a revival of movements around the world. So we have to see what it takes. I mean, if you see the rise of the right wing, it was also connected to the global economic crisis. In fact, the global economic crisis, the falling conditions of life, and also you have to link it with the falling rates of profits of private corporations, falling rate of profit for capital. The big bourgeoisie around the world were unanimous in backing the extreme right to maintain their hegemony, number one, and to maintain their profits. Because they thought that the centrists or liberals or the center-right were too weak or feeble to contain the mass upsurge against them. So since 2008, we have a crisis, financial crisis, which soon got into a sort of an economic crisis. The economy was in a stagnation. The economy is in a stagnation for most of the part of the world. This is a crisis which is lasting for a very long time. And we don't know, we don't see a way out of it till now. And then we have the pandemic. So before that, with the crisis setting in, the governments, the big bourgeoisie around the world foresaw that there will be protest against their policies, the type of policies that they implement. So they were backing the right wing, and in many cases the extreme right, like in India or in the United States or Brazil, Philippines or Turkey, or you have in Hungary and many other places in the world. So this was the situation. So we might see a turn of tide. Might see a turn of tide currently now. So it depends on how the movement picks up in the next days, which means we have a lot of responsibility to take it forward. The left has a lot of responsibility to take it forward and to reinforce our solidarities across the world. Across movements, across our common cause.
And actually, I think that's going to be probably the last part of this discussion. But when you raise this question, it's like we in Europe are also trying to fight for more like food sovereignty, to do this work here as well. And my question is, what kind of support can we send or can we actively do in your views to like support this farmers movement in India?
See, I mean, whatever said and done, now we have in India a fascist government which is extremely ultra-nationalist, parochial nationalist. But even then, if you see the expanse of global capital, their interests are tied together. So if there's a protest, if there's a news around the world, that has an impact on the Indian government. So as part of European activists, European radical milieu, European civil society, if they're able to raise consciousness about this issue, in the first place, this issue is not reported. Many Europeans don't know that there's hundreds of thousands of farmers are camping in the last 2 months in this biting cold, and they're protesting, they're fighting for their survival. In a sense, the protest against the law is a fight for their survival. So if you can if the news actually reaches to a number of Europeans, and that puts pressure on their governments, which in turn creates pressure for our government. So that's very, very important. In fact, Justin Trudeau, Canadian Prime Minister, he made a statement, and that caused immediate spark all over India. The government was quick to denounce it, but then, when you denounce something, that means you're taken care of it. You have recently also, you've seen the pop star Rihanna, who made a statement against the farmers' protest and the way the government is, she says, they support it. You've also seen statements from Greta Thunberg. So all these, a single statement is sparking a lot of impacts in India. So there has been a series of attempts by the government to cover it up, saying it's an internal issue and all these things. But, well, having said it, which means that they are afraid about international protest. They're afraid about the image of India. Well, the image of India is not the image of a common man of India, but the image of rich India, India as a destination, the image of Indian bourgeoisie abroad. So if the image of Indian bourgeoisie takes a beating around the world, that impacts our policies, that impacts the government, that impacts the policies. We don't live in a closed world. It's not Myanmar, where the junta doesn't really care about, because it's quite an internal economy. It's not their trade and commerce, their dependence on the global economy is much lesser than India. I don't know, maybe 2% or 3%. I don't know. It's not so. So the point is that if there are protests, there's solidarity. Protests, there's solidarity. Activities in Europe around the farmers' issues, that seriously impacts the government. That's what we are looking forward to our friends and comrades across the world, to speak about this issue, to raise this issue in their respective forum, to spread consciousness about the issue, to have discussions, to take inspiration from it. So, yeah,
yes.
that would be a great, huh?
And we that's what we hope to achieve with this discussion that we're going to release on social media, and we will for sure follow up and keep in touch with you.
Yes, it was nice speaking to you. Yeah, hope to catch you up sometimes else.
Yeah.
Thank you.
But thank you very much, Sushovan, for your insights, and wish you all the solidarity that you need in this fight.
Thank you, and wish you all the best too.